Opal felt the dust of Redemption Creek before she saw the town. It was a fine, gritty powder that coated her tongue and settled in the folds of her worn black dress, a constant reminder of the trail that had taken everything from her. The wagon driver who had offered passage in exchange for the last of her husband's silver dollars had deposited her on the edge of the settlement with a grunt and a flick of the reins, leaving her standing beside a meager bundle of possessions that felt heavier than any burden she had ever carried. She was a widow, a word that felt like a stone in her mouth, too new and too sharp to be real. Her husband, Thomas, lay buried 300 miles back, his grave marked by a simple wooden cross she had carved herself, the prairie wind already working to erase his name. The town itself was little more than a single dusty street, flanked by raw timber buildings, all of them staring at her with blank, unwelcoming window eyes. Faces peered out from the mercantile and the saloon, gazes lingering on her solitary figure, on the black dress that announced her grief, and the exhaustion etched into her bones. She saw judgment in their eyes, and a cold curiosity that offered no comfort. A woman alone was a problem or an opportunity, and she had no intention of being either. She walked past them, her head held high not from pride, but from a sheer refusal to be bowed by their stares. Her destination was a place she had only heard of in a hushed whisper from another traveler. A derelict line shack at the far end of town, abandoned and unwanted. A place a person could disappear into. The shack was worse than she had imagined. It leaned against the wind like a tired old man, gaps in the chinked logs wide enough to pass a hand through. The roof was a patchwork of hope and failure, and the floor was packed earth. But it had 4 walls and a door that latched, and for Opal, that was a palace. She swept the floor with a branch of sagebrush, the clean, sharp scent a small comfort in the musty air. She unpacked her bundle, a spare dress, a tarnished locket with Thomas's likeness, a small Bible, and a collection of dried herbs wrapped in cloth, her mother's only legacy. It was not much to build a life from, but it was all she had. As dusk fell, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, she sat on the rickety stoop and watched the vast, indifferent expanse of the territory swallow the sun. She was utterly and completely alone. That night, the sky broke open. It was not a gentle rain, but a violent biblical tempest. Lightning tore across the heavens, each flash illuminating her poor shelter in stark, terrifying detail. Thunder followed, a cannonade that shook the very ground she lay on. She had seen storms on the prairie, but this was different. This felt like a rage, a fury directed at the world itself. Through a gap in the logs, she could see the lights of the main ranch house, a sprawling fortress of wealth and power that sat on a rise overlooking the town. It belonged to a man she had only heard spoken of in tones of respect and fear. Calloway, the largest ranch owner in the territory, a man whose word was law. A particularly vicious crack of lightning split the air, followed instantly by a sound that was not thunder. It was the splintering of wood, a man's shouted curse, and the terrified scream of a horse. Opal pressed her face to the gap in the wall. In the flickering, unnatural light, she saw a scene of chaos unfolding at the Calloway Ranch. Men were running, lanterns swinging wildly. A massive black stallion, a creature of nightmare and legend, was rearing, its eyes wide with terror. She saw the silhouette of a tall man, Calloway, it had to be, fighting to hold the lead rope, his body braced against the animal's brute strength. But the storm was stronger. Another bolt of lightning struck a cottonwood tree not 50 yards from the paddock, and the world turned white and deafening. The stallion screamed again, a sound of pure panic, and with a final desperate surge, it tore the rope from Calloway's hands, shattered the top rail of the fence, and disappeared into the storm-lashed darkness. Calloway stood motionless for a moment, a statue of fury and defeat, before slamming his hat against his thigh and turning back toward the barn, His shoulders slumped. Opal watched until his light was gone, her heart aching not for the powerful man who had lost a valuable animal, but for the terrified creature running blind into the night. For 3 days, the Callaway Ranch was a hive of activity. Riders fanned out at dawn and returned at dusk, their faces grim and their horses lathered. The talk in town was of nothing else. The Stallion, Midnight, was more than just a horse. He was a legend, the product of years of careful breeding, worth more than most men's homes. Callaway was offering a reward that could set a man up for life, but the country was vast and treacherous. Washes could be flooded from the storm, gullies could hide a broken leg, and there were wolves, and worse, out in the high country. As the days wore on, hope began to curdle into certainty. The horse was gone for good. Opal heard the talk when she went to the mercantile to trade a bit of mending for a handful of flour. The women whispered behind their hands, their eyes flicking toward her. Mrs. Gable, the portly wife of the town banker, spoke in a voice that carried. A man like Mr. Callaway, losing control like that, it's an ill omen. The other women murmured in agreement. Opal paid them no mind. She had spent the last 3 days doing what she always did when her spirit felt frayed. She walked. She left her shack at sunrise and walked into the scrubland, not searching, but listening. She followed the quiet paths the deer made, her feet silent on the dry earth. She knew the language of the wild, the subtle signs that others missed. A broken branch, a patch of disturbed soil, the nervous chatter of a jay. She wasn't looking for a horse. She was looking for a sign of fear, a place where a panicked animal might seek refuge. On the morning of the 3rd day, she found it. Not the horse, but his tracks, high up in the rocky canyons where the junipers grew thick and low. They were frantic at first, gouged deep into the earth. But then they changed. They became a walk, then a slow, shuffling pace. He was hurt. She followed the trail for another hour until she came to a small box canyon with a seep of fresh water at its back wall. And there he was. The great black stallion stood with his head low, one foreleg held awkwardly off the ground. His magnificent coat was matted with mud and burrs, and a long, shallow gash ran along his flank, oozing blood. He was no longer a monster of fury, but a lost and wounded animal. He saw her and his head came up, ears pinned back, nostrils flaring. A low growl rumbled in his chest. He was warning her away, prepared to fight or flee, though he could do neither well. Opal didn't approach. She simply sat down on a rock 20 yards away, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't look directly at him, but kept him in the edge of her vision. From her bundle, she took a piece of dried apple she had been saving and ate it slowly. The quiet, crunching sound was the only noise in the canyon besides the buzzing of flies. She began to hum, a low, tuneless melody her mother used to sing while working in her garden. It was a sound of peace, of calm domesticity, with no demand in it. For an hour, she sat and hummed. The stallion watched her, his initial terror slowly giving way to curiosity. His ears swiveled toward her, then away, then back again. He took a hesitant step, testing his injured leg, and winced. Opal continued to hum, her eyes soft. Finally, she unwrapped one of her herb bundles. The scent of comfrey and yarrow filled the air. She began to speak to him, her voice as soft as her humming. "You had a fright," she murmured. "The sky was angry, but it's quiet now. You're safe now." The horse blew a long, shuddering breath through his nose. He took another step, then another. He was coming to her. She remained perfectly still as the massive head lowered, the great dark eyes blinking slowly. He nudged her hand with his velvet nose, smelling the herbs, smelling the apple on her breath, smelling the simple absence of fear in her. She reached up, slowly, and stroked the side of his face, her fingers finding the tense muscle in his jaw and gently rubbing. The horse leaned into her touch with a sigh that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. He had not been conquered. He had been heard. The walk back to Redemption Creek was a slow and patient procession. Opal had fashioned a simple halter from a length of rope she carried, but it was merely a suggestion. The stallion, Midnight, followed her like a shadow, his limp pronounced but his spirit calm. When they emerged from the hills and onto the main road, the town fell silent. A child playing with a hoop stopped and pointed. A blacksmith froze with his hammer in midair. Doors opened and people stepped onto their porches, their faces a mask of disbelief. There was the widow, the quiet, destitute woman nobody ever noticed, walking down the center of the street as if on a Sunday stroll. And behind her, following with the gentle deference of a lamb, was Calloway's untamable black stallion. Calloway was standing on the porch of the sheriff's office when he saw them. His conversation stopped mid-sentence. His face, which had been a thundercloud for 3 days, went slack with astonishment. He watched them approach, this small woman in black and his magnificent lost horse. He saw the makeshift rope, the calm in the animal's eyes, the way its head was level with her shoulder. He started forward, his long legs eating up the distance, his men falling in behind him. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze shifting from the horse to her face. How? It was the only word he could manage. Opal stopped and looked up at him. He was taller than she had realized, a mountain of a man clad in leather and dust, his face carved with lines of authority and recent strain. He was hurt, she said, her voice quiet but clear. And scared. He just needed someone to listen. She held out the end of the rope. Calloway didn't take it. He was staring at her, at the stillness in her gray eyes, at the complete lack of triumph or expectation on her face. He had offered a fortune for this horse, and she stood before him as if she had done nothing more than return a stray kitten. "The reward," he began, his voice rough. "I don't want a reward, Mr. Calloway," she interrupted softly. "I'm just glad he's safe." With that, she placed the rope in his hand, gave the stallion one last soft pat on the neck, and turned to walk away, back toward her lonely shack at the edge of town. Calloway stood frozen, the rope limp in his hand, watching her go. He, a man who commanded 100 men and 1,000 head of cattle, had just been completely disarmed by a woman who owned nothing but the dress on her back. He found her the next morning. He rode up to the dilapidated shack on a different horse, a steady bay gelding. He dismounted before he reached her door, a sign of respect she did not miss. She was on her stoop, mending a tear in her dress, the only other one she owned. "Mrs.?" he started, realizing he didn't even know her name. "Opal," she supplied, not looking up from her needle. "Opal." He tested the name on his tongue. It was simple and strong, like she was. "I am in your debt." She tied off her thread and finally met his gaze. "No, you're not. Your horse was in trouble. I helped." "I need a cook," he said abruptly, the words coming out harsher than he intended. "My last one ran off with a tinker. The men are living on coffee and stale biscuits. The pay is fair. Room and board included." It was not a request. It was a command disguised as an offer. He needed to understand her. He needed to have this quiet, unsettling woman somewhere he could see her, somewhere he could unravel the mystery of her. Pride and loneliness were at war within him, and he was a man unaccustomed to either. She looked from his face to the sprawling ranch on the hill, then back to the threadbare shack she called home. She had no prospects, no money, and winter was coming. Pride was a luxury she could not afford. "I can cook," she said simply. "I'll start today." Life at the Calloway Ranch was an adjustment. The main house was vast, filled with dark, heavy furniture and the lingering silence of a place that had known grief. Calloway's wife, he learned from the hushed gossip of the ranch hands, had died years ago, and the heart of the house had died with her. The men were rough and wary of her. They saw her as a strange omen, the woman who had bewitched the boss's horse. They ate her food, hearty stews, fresh bread, simple fare that was leagues better than what they were used to. But they kept their distance. Opal didn't mind. She found her solace not with the people, but with the animals. There was a mare in the corral, a fiery sorrel that no one could get near. She had kicked 2 stable hands and bitten the foreman. They called her Spitfire. Opal started leaving a cut apple on the fence rail for her each morning. She would stand nearby, humming her tuneless songs, never trying to touch the horse, just letting her presence be known. After a week, the mare began to watch for her, nickering softly when she approached. Calloway observed this from the porch of the main house, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand. He saw the same patience, the same quiet power she had used on Midnight. It wasn't magic. It was something quieter and far more potent. One morning, she woke to find a pail of fresh, warm milk on the small porch outside her room at the back of the cookhouse. There was no note, no sign of who left it. But she knew. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, a silent message that passed between them in the pre-dawn stillness. He was watching her. He was seeing her. A strange warmth bloomed in her chest, a feeling she thought had been buried with Thomas. It was hope, fragile and tentative, but there all the same. She used the milk to make biscuits, and when she served Calloway his breakfast, their eyes met for a fraction of a second over the plate. It was enough. The moment that changed everything came a month later. A yearling colt, spooked by a snake, had gotten himself tangled in a stretch of barbed wire down by the creek. By the time the hands found him, he was in a panicked frenzy, thrashing and screaming, tearing his own flesh to ribbons with every movement. The foreman, a hard man named Jed, had his rifle out. "No saving him, boss," he said to Calloway, who had ridden up at the sound of the commotion. "He's tearing himself apart. Best to put him down." Calloway's face was a mask of grim reluctance. The colt was from a good line. But Jed was right. To approach the animal now was to risk getting killed. "Wait," a voice said. It was Opal. She had come running from the house, carrying a bucket of water and a bundle of clean rags. The men turned to stare at her. "Get back, woman," Jed snarled. "This ain't no place for you." Opal ignored him, her eyes fixed on the terrified colt. She walked forward slowly, her steps measured and calm. "Opal, no," Calloway said, his voice sharp with alarm. She didn't stop. She began to speak to the horse, the same low, murmuring tones she had used in the canyon with Midnight. "Easy now. Easy, little one. The fear is sharp, I know, but we can make it stop." The colt continued to thrash, its eyes rolling white, but its screams quieted to panicked whimpers. It was listening. She got within 10 feet and set the bucket down. She dipped a rag in the water and held it out, letting the scent of it carry on the breeze. She never took her eyes off the horse's eyes. "Calloway," she said, her voice never rising, "your knife. Be ready." He was already moving, sliding from his saddle, his own astonishment forgotten in the face of her incredible calm. He watched, mesmerized, as she took another step and another. She reached the horse and, instead of going for the wire, she laid a hand flat on its trembling neck. She applied a gentle, steady pressure, murmuring to it all the while. "You feel that? That's just a hand. That's not the wire. I am not the wire." Miraculously, the colt stilled. Its body was quivering like a plucked string, but it stood, frozen under her touch. "Now," she breathed. Calloway moved in, his knife flashing. He worked quickly, his hands sure and practiced, slicing through the thick leather of his own saddle cinch to get a better angle to cut the wire away. The barbs were embedded deep in the colt's flesh. As he worked on the last strand, which was wrapped tight around the animal's leg, his hand brushed against Opal's. Her skin was cool, steady. The touch shot through him like a lightning strike, a jolt of feeling in a part of him he thought was long dead. He pulled the last piece of wire free and stepped back. Opal kept her hand on the colt's neck, stroking it, her voice a constant, soothing river of sound until its breathing evened out. They stood there for a long moment, the two of them and the wounded horse, surrounded by a ring of stunned and silent ranch hands. In that shared silence, over the body of a saved animal, something unspoken was forged between them. He looked at her, truly saw the strength that lay beneath her quiet exterior, and knew he was in the presence of something rare and profound. The wall around his heart, built of grief and pride, did not just crack. It began to crumble. The town, however, was not as easily won over. Redemption Creek was a place that distrusted anything it could not understand, and Opal was an enigma. The quiet respect she was earning at the ranch did not extend beyond its gates. The whispers that had started after she brought Midnight back now grew into a chorus, fanned by the jealous and the fearful. The chief architect of this campaign was Mrs. Gable, the banker's wife. She had long considered Calloway a prime match for her own vapid daughter, and she saw the quiet widow as an obstacle, a threat. "It isn't natural the way she is with beasts," Mrs. Gable would say over tea with the other town matriarchs. "A God-fearing woman has a healthy respect for a wild animal. She's like them, too quiet, too watchful." The poison spread. She was a charmer, they said, a woman who used strange prairie magic to get her way. Hadn't she appeared from nowhere? Hadn't she tamed the untamable? It was the work of something dark. The talk turned her quiet competence into cunning, her patience into a trap. They conveniently forgot she had saved the horse. The story became that she had somehow lured it, bewitched it for her own gain. Opal felt the change like a shift in the weather. The store clerk who had been civil now became curt, barely meeting her eyes. Women would cross the street to avoid walking on the same boardwalk as her. At the small clapboard church on Sunday, the pew she chose would remain empty, a stark island of isolation in the crowded room. Calloway, busy with the autumn roundup, was away from the ranch for days at a time and didn't see the worst of it. Opal never spoke of it. She had endured scorn before. She would endure it again. She wrapped her solitude around her like a shawl and poured her attention into her work, into the animals who asked for nothing but kindness and offered it in return. But the whispers were taking their toll. She saw her reflection in a window pane one afternoon and saw a ghost. A thin, pale woman in a faded dress, with eyes that held a permanent sadness. The hope that had begun to bloom in her chest was withering. She was an outsider here, just as she had been everywhere else. The small moments of connection with Calloway, a shared look across the dinner table, his hand brushing hers as he took a cup of coffee, felt like a dream from another life. In the cold light of day, he was the powerful owner of the Calloway Ranch, and she was the hired cook, the strange widow with an unnatural gift. The malice finally came to a head on a Saturday afternoon in the Mercantile. Opal was buying flour and salt, her list short, her intention to be in and out as quickly as possible. Mrs. Gable was there, holding court with her circle of gossips. As Opal approached the counter, Mrs. Gable's son, a fleshy, red-faced young man named Silas, who had all of his mother's arrogance and none of her cunning, stepped in front of her. He smelled of whiskey and cheap cigars. "Well, well," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire store to hear. "If it isn't the horse witch." Opal tried to step around him, her face impassive. "Excuse me," she said. Silas blocked her path again. "Trying to work your spells on Calloway, are you? Think a man like that would ever look at a dried-up crow like you? He feels sorry for you." that's all. A bit of Christian charity." The other women tittered. The storekeeper looked down, busying himself under the counter. No one would help her. "I don't know what you're talking about," Opal said, her voice low and steady, betraying none of the cold dread coiling in her stomach. "Oh, I think you do," Silas sneered, his face close to hers. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Everyone knows what you are. A grifter, a parasite. You come here with nothing, and now you're living high on Calloway's dollar. How'd you do it? What dark bargain did you make?" Opal stood perfectly still, her eyes locked on his. She did not struggle. She did not cry out. She simply endured it, her silence a more powerful rebuke than any words she could have spoken. But inside, something shattered. The fragile shell of dignity she had so carefully maintained was broken, and the humiliation was a physical pain. Finally, the storekeeper, Mr. Harris, cleared his throat. "Now, Silas, that's enough." Silas laughed, shoved her arm away, and turned back to his mother, preening. "Just telling the truth," he said. Opal paid for her flour, her hands trembling slightly, and walked out of the store, the silent stares of the townspeople like daggers in her back. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in her small room and looked at her meager possessions. The town had declared its verdict. She was a witch, a pariah. To stay would be to invite more of the same, to live under a cloud of suspicion and hate. More than that, she was tainting Calloway's name. They were calling his kindness a weakness, his decency a sign of bewitchment. She could not do that to him. She would not be the cause of his dishonor. Before the first hint of dawn colored the sky, she had packed her small bundle. She wrote a short, simple note and left it on the kitchen table. "Thank you for your kindness. I cannot stay." She slipped out of the house as quietly as she had arrived, a ghost leaving a place she had briefly, foolishly, begun to think of as home. She didn't get as far as the main gate. A rider was coming up the ranch road, a dark silhouette against the pale gray of the false dawn. It was Calloway. He had returned from the roundup a day early. He saw her, a small, solitary figure with a bundle in her hand, and his horse slowed to a walk. He swung down from the saddle before he reached her, his face unreadable in the dim light. "Where are you going, Opal?" he asked, his voice quiet, devoid of accusation. It was worse than anger. It was a question steeped in a weariness that matched her own. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice catching. I can't stay here." He took a step closer. "I heard what happened in town, Jed told me." Opal flinched, the shame of it washing over her again. "Then you understand. They see me as a curse on you. On this ranch." He was standing in front of her now, so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. He smelled of leather, sweat, and the open range. He reached out, not to grab her, but to gently take the bundle from her hands. He set it on the ground. "Don't go," he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a lifetime. He looked away from her, toward the mountains that were just beginning to catch the morning light. "My wife, Eleanor," he began, his voice rough with emotion he rarely showed. "She was a gentle woman, delicate. She told me she wasn't strong enough for the birth. The doctor said she was fine. I said she was fine. I told her to be strong. I didn't listen." He paused, and the silence was filled with a grief that was still raw after all these years. "She died. And the baby with her. She died because I was too proud to listen to what she was telling me without words. I closed myself off after that. I stopped listening to anything but the wind and the balance sheets." He turned back to face her, his eyes dark with a pain she recognized. "And then you came?" he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You walked that stallion out of the hills. You quieted Spitfire. You saved that colt. You don't command things. Opal, you listen to them, to the fear behind the rage, to the pain behind the panic. You listen to things other people just shout at. He took a breath, and the admission that came next felt like it was torn from his very soul. I need that. I am tired of shouting. It was the most vulnerable he had ever been, a confession of his own deep wound. He was not rescuing her from leaving, he was asking her to save him from himself. Tears she had refused to shed in the mercantile now tracked silently down her cheeks. In his raw confession, she heard the echo of her own loneliness, her own grief. She had been listening to the pain in animals because she understood it so well. He was the first person to see that, to see her gift not as a strange power, but as a form of empathy. She didn't offer him words of comfort. Instead, she reached out and placed her hand on his forearm. A simple touch of solidarity. He covered her hand with his own, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. It was an anchor in the storm. "All right, Calloway," she whispered. "I'll stay." But they did not go back to the house. "Come with me," he said, his hand still holding hers. He led her not to the stables, but to the main paddock where Midnight was kept. He opened the gate, and the great black stallion trotted over, nickering softly as it saw Opal. Calloway picked up the lead rope and pressed it into her other hand. Then he led her, with the stallion following placidly, back down the ranch road and toward town. They walked side by side, a silent, determined procession. The sun was rising now, and the town was coming to life. People stopped and stared at the sight. The powerful rancher, the strange widow, and the legendary horse, all walking together as if they were one. He didn't stop at the edge of town. He walked them straight to the mercantile where a small crowd was already gathering, drawn by the strange spectacle. Mrs. Gable and her son Silas were just stepping out of the bank. Their mouths fell open. Calloway stopped in the middle of the street, turning to face them all. He let go of Opal's hand but remained standing by her side, a silent guard. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried with an authority that no one in Redemption Creek dared to question. "There has been talk," he began, his eyes sweeping over the crowd. "Ugly talk. About this woman." He gestured to Opal. "You've called her a witch, a charlatan." His gaze settled on Silas Gable, who shrank back. "You have mistaken quietness for cunning, and kindness for a trick." He then looked at Opal, and then at the stallion who stood so calmly by her side, occasionally nudging her shoulder with its nose. "You see this horse?" Calloway's voice rang out. "I command 100 things a day, men, cattle, the affairs of this town. But I could not command this animal. My strength was useless against his fear. She came to him with no whip, no rope, no force at all. She came with patience. She listened to what he was afraid of." He looked back at the crowd, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "This isn't witchcraft. This is kindness, a currency that seems to have been forgotten in this town." He let the words hang in the air, a profound and public rebuke. Then he turned to Opal, and in front of everyone he gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. "Her name is Opal, and she is a guest of my ranch for as long as she wishes to stay. Anyone who has a problem with that has a problem with me." The silence that followed was absolute. Mrs. Gable's face was a mottled purple, and Silas looked at the ground as if hoping it would swallow him. The town had been put on notice, the line had been drawn, and Calloway had, without hesitation, chosen to stand on her side of it. 6 months later, the first snows were dusting the high peaks of the mountains. A small, tidy herb garden, now dormant for the winter, sat by the porch of the main ranch house. It was Opal's. She was no longer the cook, though she still made Calloway's coffee just the way he liked it. She now ran the breeding program for his horses, her quiet way achieving better results than any foreman ever had. The house was no longer silent. There was the sound of her humming in the kitchen, the soft click of her knitting needles by the fire in the evening. She had brought life back into the empty rooms. She was standing on the porch, wrapped in a thick wool shawl Calloway had bought for her, watching the evening sky turn a soft rose gold. He came and stood beside her, not speaking, just sharing the view. The comfortable silence between them was their favorite language. After a few minutes, he cleared his throat. "The fence on the west pasture took a beating in that last wind," he said. "I thought you might want to ride out with me tomorrow, to check on the new foals." It wasn't a question about a fence. It was a question about all their tomorrows. It was his way of saying he wanted to spend them with her, riding side by side. Opal turned to him, a real, full smile lighting up her face, chasing away the last of the shadows from her eyes. "I'd like that very much, Calloway," she said. He reached out and took her hand, his rough palm warm and steady around hers. The frontier was still a wild and unforgiving place, but here, in the circle of this man's quiet strength, she had found more than a shelter. She had found her home. The world had once discarded her as a lonely widow, but here she was, seen and valued by the most powerful man in the territory. And in healing his broken heart, she had finally healed her own. Their rescue had been mutual, a slow and steady mending of two solitary souls, a testament to the fact that the greatest strength is not in the power to command, but in the courage to listen.